I am Hamish Macbeth, and welcome to the Crimson Noir.
The sky above Lochduff was an uninterrupted, piercing blue, the kind of clear, biting morning that made the heather crunch underfoot and turned the surface of the loch into a sheet of hammered steel. There was not a single cloud to obscure the sun, nor a drop of rain to dampen the hills. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was currently engaged in highly official business. He was lying flat on his back, on a sun-warmed slab of granite, his peaked cap pulled entirely over his fiery red hair and eyes, whilst his mongrel dog, Lugs, chewed lazily on a rabbit bone nearby. Hamish possessed a lanky, deceptively fragile frame and an overwhelming desire to be left entirely alone. Down in the village, the police station was cold, and the radio on his desk was undoubtedly squawking with tedious inquiries from police headquarters in Strathbane. If he answered, some over-eager desk sergeant might assign him actual work. Worse, if he did the work well, he might be promoted, dragged away from his beloved Highland mountains, and forced into a cramped, noisy city where a man couldn't properly poach a salmon to save his life. It was a delicate balance, being just incompetent enough to be ignored, but not so useless as to be fired. Hamish was an artist at it. His peaceful communion with the Highland frost was shattered by a mechanical roar that echoed off the mountains, followed by the aggressive, blaring wail of an air horn. Hamish lifted his cap an inch, exposing one hazel eye. Now, what in the name of all that's holy is that? Lugs. Lugs stopped chewing and let out a low growl. Hamish sighed, hauling himself up. He peered down the slope toward the village. A monstrous, gleaming white double-decker tour bus, a veritable block of flats on wheels, was attempting to navigate the narrow, single-track stone bridge that served as the primary entrance to Lochduff. It was, predictably, hopelessly wedged between the ancient stone parapets. A queue of angry local sheep, herded by a deeply unamused farmer, was already backing up behind it. Sassenachs, Hamish muttered, brushing dried heather from his uniform. Only an Englishman with more money than sense would hire a bloody spaceship to drive through Sutherland, with the heavy, dragging footsteps of a man heading to the gallows. Hamish ambled down the hill. By the time he reached the waterfront, half the village had turned out to watch the spectacle. Mr. Wellington, the local minister, was standing outside the manse, arms crossed. I give it 10 minutes before the stone gives way and the whole gaudy thing tips into the loch, he observed mildly to Hamish. We can only pray, said Mr. Curry, the local hotelier, who had stepped out in his apron, holding a cup of steaming tea, though I'd pity the fish, having to look at that paint job. The door of the great white Leviathan hissed open, and the interlopers descended. They did not look like standard tourists. The first to step off was a middle-aged man with a face the color of boiled beef, wearing a tweed suit that was far too pristine to have ever seen a Moor. He immediately began shouting at the terrified driver. Behind him emerged a young woman, wrapped in a faux fur coat that looked thick enough to suffocate a bear. She had perfectly coiffed blonde hair, heavily manicured nails, and an expression of utter, venomous disdain for her surroundings. Hamish let his jaw slacken and his eyes glaze over, adopting the expression of a particularly dim-witted village idiot. He slouched over to the fuming man. "Och, having a bit of a bother, are we?" Hamish drawled, his Highland accent suddenly thick and slow as treacle. The red-faced man rounded him. "Bother, bother. Are you the local constabulary? My name is Arthur Sterling. We have rented Glenmoor Castle for my daughter's wedding, and this glorified cart path you call a road has ruined the suspension on my hired coach. I demand you do something." Hamish scratched his head slowly. "Well, sir, the bridge has been there since 1740. I dinna think I can ask it to move." Arthur Sterling's eyes bulged. The young woman in the fur coat, the bride-to-be, evidently stomped over, her designer boots clicking sharply on the frost-hardened road. "Daddy, this is intolerable," she snapped. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "You promised me a rustic, authentic Scottish fairy tale. Instead, I'm freezing to death. The caterers are stuck in Inverness, and this peasant in a uniform is just standing there. Now, Arabella, darling. murmured a third figure, a pale, nervous-looking young man with a receding hairline who had slinked off the bus behind her. The groom. He looked as though he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "I'm sure the officer is doing his best." "Shut up, Rupert," Arabella hissed. She returned her venom to Hamish. "Get this bus unstuck, and then go to the castle and ensure the heating is on. I am not catching a chill before my rehearsal dinner." Hamish didn't blink. Behind his vacant, dopey facade, his sharp mind was already cataloguing the dynamics. Arthur Sterling was an arrogant bully who used money as a bludgeon. Rupert was terrified of his bride, and Arabella Sterling was a tyrant. But as Hamish watched her, he noticed her eyes kept darting nervously toward the tree line, beyond the village, her fingers twisting her spectacular diamond engagement ring with white-knuckled anxiety. She wasn't just angry. She was spooked. "I'm a policeman, miss, not a boiler repairman," Hamish said mildly. "And as for the bus, the driver just needs to reverse about a mile up the single track. Very slowly." The driver, overhearing this, dropped his head onto the steering wheel in despair. Leaving the Sassenachs to their misery, Hamish tipped his hat and wandered off toward Patel's shop. He had successfully avoided doing any actual work, but his stomach was rumbling, and a deep, sinking feeling in his chest told him that the arrival of Arabella Sterling was going to thoroughly ruin his week. Pushing open the door to the shop, the bell jingling merrily above his head, Hamish inhaled the comforting scent of spices and instant coffee. "Morning, Hamish," Mr. Patel called from behind the counter, pouring a black coffee without needing to be asked. "The English invasion has begun, I see." "Aye," Hamish sighed, leaning heavily against the counter and taking the warm mug gratefully. "A wedding party up at Glenmoor. They'll be miserable," Mr. Patel predicted cheerfully. "The castle's draughty. The plumbing shrieks, and Mrs. McFarlane is doing their catering. She puts haggis in the vegetarian quiche." Hamish took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the heat seep back into his bones. He looked out the frosted window of the shop, watching Arabella Sterling scream at a passing flock of sheep. "She's a nasty piece of work, that bride," Hamish murmured, more to himself than to Patel. "But someone's frightened the life out of her. I give it 2 days before they're all at each other's throats." He was wrong, of course. It wouldn't even take 2 days for the screaming to start. The morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Sutherland Mountains, painting the frost-covered heather in brilliant shades of gold and lavender. Inside the Lockdown police station, the iron stove radiated a glorious, suffocating heat. Hamish Macbeth was in a state of profound contentment. He was slouched in his battered armchair, his tunic unbuttoned, his stockinged feet resting dangerously close to the hot metal grate. A massive bowl of porridge, heavily fortified with cream and a generous glug of whiskey, rested on his lap. Beside him, Lugs let out a long, whistling snore. It was a perfect Tuesday. The radio was mercifully silent. The village was quiet. Then, the heavy wooden door of the station burst open with the subtlety of an artillery shell. Hamish flinched, splashing a dollop of hot porridge onto his thumb. He cursed mildly, sucking the burn as a figure tumbled into the room. It was Rupert, the nervous groom from the day before, though he looked considerably worse for wear. His pale face was now the color of old parchment, his thinning hair stood up in static tufts, and he was hyperventilating so violently that his tweed waistcoat heaved. "She's dead," Rupert shrieked, his voice cracking into a shrill falsetto. "Arabella, oh God, it's horrible." Hamish did not leap to his feet. He did not issue crisp, authoritative commands. Instead, he stared mournfully at his ruined porridge, mourning the loss of a perfectly good, lazy morning. He let out a long, long sigh. "Aye," Hamish said slowly, setting the bowl aside. "I suppose you'd better sit down before you faint on my clean floor." "What do you mean? Dead? Murdered, I think. I don't know." Rupert clutched his head. In the dairy shed behind the castle. "You must come." Hamish slowly laced up his heavy boots, retrieved his peaked cap, and whistled for Lugs. He made a point of looking entirely unbothered, though his mind was already shifting gears. The sluggish village bobby routine hiding a razor-sharp alertness. The drive up to Glenmoor Castle in the police Land Rover took less than 10 minutes. The frost on the estate grounds sparkled under the clear, cloudless sky, utterly indifferent to human tragedy. Hamish parked near the crumbling stone outbuildings that housed the old dairy. He ambled out, his uniform crumpled, his red hair sticking out wildly from under his cap. He looked less like an officer of the law and more like a poacher who had stolen a uniform. Arthur Sterling, the belligerent father of the bride, was pacing furiously outside the shed. His face purple. "About time you got here, you useless lout," Sterling bellowed. "My daughter has been killed in this god-forsaken wasteland, and they send a village idiot. A very good morning to you too, Mr. Sterling," Hamish murmured, stepping past the shouting man and into the dim, stone-flagged shed. The scene inside was bizarre, grim, and entirely undignified. Arabella Sterling, who only yesterday had looked down her aristocratic nose at the entirety of Lochdubuff, was currently suspended headfirst in an enormous antique wooden churning vat used for separating whey. Her legs, clad in incredibly expensive silk pajamas and fur-trimmed slippers, dangled awkwardly in the air. Her torso was wedged tight in the narrow neck of the vat. The overpowering, sour stench of old milk hung heavy in the freezing air. Hamish stood with his hands in his pockets, observing. Lugs trotted over, gave the vat a tentative sniff, and sneezed violently. "Did anyone touch her?" Hamish asked lazily, his hazel eyes tracking the scuff marks on the dusty stone floor. "I tried to pull her out," Rupert sobbed from the doorway. "But she's stuck fast. She's cold. Constable, she's terribly cold." Hamish leaned closer, careful not to disturb the immediate perimeter. He noted the furious scratches on the exterior wood of the vat, indicating a struggle. Someone had forced her in, but what fascinated Hamish was the trail of pristine, glittering white powder dusted across the flagstones, leading directly from the door to the vat. It wasn't flour. It looked suspiciously like the expensive imported bath. Salt's Arabella had likely demanded for her evening soak. Why was she out here in the freezing dairy shed, in her pajamas, trailing bath salts? "This is an outrage," Arthur Sterling roared, pushing his way inside. "I demand a proper detective. Get Scotland Yard on the telephone immediately. I will not have my daughter's murder investigated by a peasant who looks like he sleeps in a barn." Hamish suppressed a smile, feeling that familiar, comforting mask of stupidity settle securely over his features. "Och, well, sir, we dinna have Scotland Yard up here in Sutherland," he drawled, scratching his chin as if profoundly bewildered. "But I'll be having to ring Strathbane. They'll send DCI Blair. He's a vera important man." Hamish turned his back on the furious father and the weeping groom, staring thoughtfully at the soles of Arabella's incredibly expensive, thoroughly ruined slippers. The peace of Lochdubuff was shattered. His beautiful, lazy Tuesday was gone, replaced by a corpse in a butter vat, and the impending, dreadful arrival of his worst enemy. It was going to be a terribly long week. The arrival of the Strathbane police force was heralded by a cacophony of sirens that shattered the crisp Highland silence and sent a flock of startled sheep scattering across the moors. Hamish Macbeth stood by the entrance to the dairy shed, his hands deep in his pockets, leaning against the cold stone wall, with the practiced air of a man who had nowhere else to be. Two cruisers screeched to a halt on the gravel, spraying pebbles against the castle's ancient foundation. DCI Blair emerged from the lead vehicle, like a bull charging into an arena. He was a man of aggressive proportions. His face permanently flushed the color of a bruised plum, veins bulging in his neck as if he were perpetually on the verge of an apoplectic fit. "Macbeth," Blair bellowed before his feet had even touched the ground. "Stand aside. Clear the area. Get that flea-bitten mongrel away from the crime scene." Lugs, having heard this exact sentiment on dozens of occasions, merely blinked and curled his tail tighter around his paws. Hamish offered a slow, vacuous grin. "Morning, sir. Grand day for a drive up from Strathbane, isn't it? The roads are a bit treacherous, but I'm sure you handled them fine. Don't give me your simpleton routine, you lazy, incompetent oaf." Blair stomped up to him, his spit landing on the lapel of Hamish's worn uniform. "I've heard the report. A murder in a dairy shed. A high-profile case involving international guests. And it's happened on your watch. My blood pressure is already through the roof, and I haven't even seen the body yet." Blair shoved past him, nearly knocking Hamish off balance. He marched into the shed, his team of uniformed officers trailing behind him like nervous ducklings. "Good God," Blair gasped, stopping dead in his tracks as he beheld the sight of the late Arabella Sterling, still dangling from the antique cairn. He turned, his face darkening with a familiar, misplaced sense of authority. "It's obvious. Look at this." He pointed a thick, trembling finger at the weeping groom, Rupert. "An outsider comes to a remote village, gets involved with a local, and things turn sour. It's a classic passion crime. The groom clearly couldn't handle the pressure of the wedding, or perhaps she threatened to call it off, and he did her in." Rupert let out a stifled sob. "I loved her. I didn't kill her. Save it for the interrogation room," Blair roared. He turned to one of his officers, a young, eager constable with a notebook. "Get him out of my sight. Take him to the station, hold him, and don't let him talk to anyone. I want a confession before lunch. This is an open and shut case." Hamish stood in the corner, his face a mask of mild, dull-witted bewilderment. "But, sir," he drawled, his voice purposefully grating and slow, "Mr. Rupert there, he's been crying for the last hour. Doesn't seem like the sort to stuff a woman into a vat, does he? And he's got no dirt on his shoes. The floor of that shed was covered in that fine white powder stuff. If he'd struggled with her, there'd be traces on him. Surely." Blair whips, his eyes narrowing to slits. "I didn't ask for your opinion, Macbeth. I didn't ask for your expert analysis of shoe polish or fairy dust. You have demonstrated, time and time again, that your primary contribution to this force is occupying space. Return to your station and file the paperwork for the forensics team. You are officially relieved of all investigative duties." "Right you are, sir," Hamish said, tipping his cap with an exaggerated, servile motion. "Whatever you think is best." "Get out," Blair yelled, his face now a shade of crimson that suggested a medical emergency was imminent. Hamish didn't need to be told twice. He whistled for lugs and began the slow trudge back toward the Land Rover. Behind him, he could hear Blair shouting orders, his voice echoing off the castle walls as he bullied the grieving father and berated his own officers for not finding the obvious murder weapon immediately. As Hamish reached his vehicle, he paused, looking back at the dark, looming shape of the castle. His laziness had served its purpose. By playing the fool, he had managed to get himself sidelined, which gave him the freedom he needed to actually find the truth. Blair would waste the next 24 hours badgering a terrified, innocent man, while the real killer would assume the investigation was effectively closed. It was a dangerous game, but one he knew well. He pulled a crumpled cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and inhaled deeply. The wind was picking up, swirling the dying leaves of autumn across the driveway. "He's chasing the wrong rabbit, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his eyes narrowing as he watched the frantic activity around the dairy shed. "And the sooner he gets frustrated, the easier it'll be for us to slip in through the back door. Now, let's go find a warm kitchen and a sympathetic ear. I have a feeling the truth is hiding somewhere between the village gossip and the tea service." He climbed into the Land Rover, the engine turning over with a reluctant, rattling cough, and drove away, leaving behind the screaming DCI and the corpse in the churn, feeling less like a lazy policeman and more like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The village of Lockduff was a place where information moved faster than the tide, yet it always arrived coated in a thick layer of local prejudice. By the time Hamish had driven his battered Land Rover back down the single-track road, the news of the Sassenach murder had already reached every hearth, oven, and bedside table. Hamish knew that official police questioning was a blunt instrument, a sledgehammer meant to crack a nut. His own method, by contrast, was the art of the mooch. It required patience, a bottomless capacity for tea, and the ability to listen to what people didn't say. He parked his vehicle behind the post office, where Mrs. McPhee was currently holding court. "Mrs. McPhee, a woman whose girth was matched only by the reach of her ears, was the unofficial arbiter of truth in the village. If a secret existed in Lochduff, Mrs. McPhee either knew it or had helped invent it. "Hamish Macbeth," she chirped, peering over her half-moon spectacles as he entered. "I suppose you've come for the mail. Or perhaps you've come to tell us why the great DCI Blair is currently screaming at a pile of rocks up at the castle." Hamish leaned against the counter, giving her his most vacant, weary smile. I wouldn't know, Mrs. McPhee. Blair doesn't talk to me much. Says I'm a bit slow, and he's probably right. I've just been sent off to do the paperwork. A man gets awfully thirsty doing paperwork. Any chance of a cup of tea?" Mrs. McPhee softened, as she always did for the poor. Neglected local constable. She bustled into the back room, and moments later she returned with a chipped mug of tea and a plate of shortbread that was thick enough to break a tooth. "It's a tragedy, truly," she began, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you know, that Arabella girl, she wasn't quite the angel the papers will make her out to be. I saw her talking to the delivery man yesterday. The one from the fishmonger in Inverness. She looked positively terrified. And she wasn't wearing her ring. She had it off, twisting it round and round, looking like she wanted to throw it into the loch." Hamish munched on a piece of shortbread, his eyes dulling slightly as if he was struggling to process the information. "Really? That's strange. Engaged women usually love their rings." "Exactly." Mrs. McPhee leaned in closer, the scent of lavender soap and old parchment clinging to her. "And then there's the matter of the secret meetings. I saw her sneaking down toward the old pier after dark, twice. She wasn't meeting her groom, that's for sure. The poor boy was pacing the ballroom floor like a trapped stag." Hamish thanked her, finished his tea with a gratified sigh, and wandered back out into the cool, biting air. He whistled for Lugs, who had been busy investigating a particularly interesting patch of moss near the bin. His next stop was the local curry shop, run by Mr. Patel. It was the only place in the village where one could get a meal that didn't involve boiled mutton, and Patel was always good for a chat. He found the man scrubbing the front window, his face set in a grim line. "Blair's men have been here, Hamish," Patel said without preamble. "They asked if I saw anyone suspicious near the castle last night. I told them I saw no one, which is true, but I did see something." Hamish slumped into one of the plastic chairs, looking utterly disinterested. "Aye? Something interesting." "The bride's father, Mr. Sterling," Patel said, glancing toward the door to ensure no one was listening. "He was arguing with someone behind the shed around midnight. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone. It was threatening." Sterling was red-faced, pointing his finger. The other person, I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, they were wearing a heavy, dark coat, eventually walked away, and Sterling looked like he was about to have a stroke. Hamish tapped his fingers on the table. "Could it have been the groom?" "No," Patel shook his head. "The person was taller than Rupert, much taller, and they walked with a limp, a distinct, dragging gait." Hamish nodded slowly. A limp, a secret meeting, a nervous bride who was terrified of her own wedding. It was all starting to paint a picture, one that had nothing to do with a crime of passion, and everything to do with something much colder, something involving secrets that were worth killing to keep quiet. He walked back to his Land Rover as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the valley. He had the pieces now. The official investigation was focused on a simple domestic tragedy. But Hamish knew the truth was far more complex. He didn't need DNA, he had gossip, he had observation, and he had the knowledge of who, in this village, would have the gall to commit such a crime. He sat in the driver's seat and looked up at the castle. The lights were burning bright, a false, golden glow in the encroaching dark. Blair would be sitting in the study, drinking whiskey and congratulating himself on a job well done. Meanwhile, Hamish would spend his evening with the only thing he really trusted, his own intuition. He didn't have a forensic lab, but he had the rhythm of the village, and he was beginning to hear the discordant note that meant someone was lying. He turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and headed into the gathering gloom, ready to peel back the layers of a murder that had only just begun to show its teeth. The late afternoon light was fading into a bruised purple, casting long, mournful shadows across the manicured grounds of Glenmoor Castle. Hamish Macbeth steered his Land Rover toward the gatehouse, his mind turning over the fragments of information he had gathered, like a man sorting through a handful of sea glass. He had the limp, the argument, and the terrified bride. What he lacked was the connective tissue, the reason why such a polished, wealthy woman would find herself in a cold dairy shed with a violent end. As he pulled up near the main entrance, a sleek, silver Jaguar purred into view, coming to a halt just feet from his own battered vehicle. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She looked as though she had been carved from marble, her regal posture and elegant wool coat providing a stark, almost painful contrast to the rugged, untamed beauty of the Highlands. Priscilla had been the bane and the delight of Hamish's life for years. She was everything he was not: wealthy, ambitious, and deeply concerned with social proprieties. Yet, in the quiet, unspoken language they shared, there was an understanding that transcended their different worlds. "Hamish," she said, her voice cool and crisp, cutting through the damp air, "I heard the news. Please, tell me you aren't doing something spectacularly foolish." Hamish climbed out of the Land Rover, shrugging his shoulders as if to emphasize the sag in his uniform. "Och, Priscilla, I'm just doing my job, or rather, I'm trying to avoid doing it. But DCI Blair is making that quite difficult." Priscilla walked over to him, her eyes searching his face. She had long ago learned to look past the village idiot act. She saw the flickers of intelligence, the stillness in his posture, and the way his hands stayed steady even when he was describing a murder. "Blair is currently in the drawing room, holding court," she whispered, stepping closer so their conversation was lost to the wind. "He's convinced the groom did it. He's already drafted a statement for the press. It's an embarrassment, Hamish. The man is blinded by his own desire to close the file and get home in time for dinner." "He's looking at the obvious," Hamish agreed softly, leaning against the cold metal of his car. "But the obvious is rarely the truth in a place like this. Tell me, you move in these circles. Did you know the Sterlings?" Priscilla sighed, a sound that carried a hint of genuine sadness. "I knew of them. Arabella wasn't well liked in society circles. She had a penchant for acquiring things that didn't belong to her. Not just jewelry, but people. She had a way of exerting influence that was quite devastating." "Influence over whom?" "Over many, but specifically the staff," Priscilla noted, her gaze drifting toward the castle. "There was a scandal last year involving a family estate in the south. A young woman, a maid, was accused of theft. She was fired without reference, and her reputation was ruined. It was all very hushed up, but the rumor was that Arabella had planted the evidence to cover her own tracks. If someone from her past had followed her here." Hamish felt a cold prickle of realization at the back of his neck. The limp Patel had mentioned a tall, limping figure, a vengeful spirit from a past life, seeking a reckoning in the isolation of the Highlands. "You're thinking of someone who wanted revenge," Priscilla said, reading his expression. "That makes sense. But Hamish, you have to be careful. If you cross Blair, he'll have your badge before you can explain your theory." "I don't care about the badge, Priscilla," Hamish replied, his voice uncharacteristically firm. "I care about the truth. Blair is busy bullying a boy who couldn't even kill a spider, let alone a bride. If he makes an arrest, the real killer walks free, and that won't happen on my watch." Priscilla reached out, her gloved hand momentarily touching his arm, a rare, fleeting moment of intimacy that made Hamish's heart skip a beat. "You're the only one who sees them, aren't you? The people the rest of the world overlooks. That is your strength, Hamish. Don't let your desire to be invisible cost you your integrity." She stepped back, her poise returning, as if she were afraid of showing too much concern. "I must go. My parents are expecting me for the viewing. Just promise me one thing. Don't let him get away with it." "I promise," Hamish said, watching as she turned back to her car. As she drove away, the roar of her engine fading into the vastness of the hills, Hamish felt a renewed sense of purpose. Priscilla had given him the final piece of the puzzle, a motive rooted in past trauma, a history of stolen reputations and shattered lives. He wasn't just a lazy policeman avoiding work anymore. He was a hunter. He watched the moon rise over the peaks, the silver light turning the landscape into a ghostly, monochromatic dream. The pieces were shifting, the picture was becoming clear, and for the first time that day, Hamish felt the thrill of the chase. He whistled for Lugs, his companion responding with a sharp, alert bark. The night was young, and the truth, for all its darkness, was waiting to be found in the shadows of Glenmoor. The atmosphere inside the local holding cell, a repurposed storage room at the back of the Lockdown police station, was stifling. DCI Blair was pacing the length of the narrow corridor, his face a mottled, angry red. He was in the middle of delivering a lecture on the absolute certainty of criminal psychology to a room full of bemused local constables who had long ago learned to tune out his booming, self-important voice. "It's not complicated, you idiots," Blair shouted, slamming a fist onto the wooden table. The groom, Rupert, was seen arguing with her. He had the means, he had the proximity, and he clearly cracked under the pressure of an impending, high-stakes marriage. We have his confession, or at least the beginning of a confession, and we have the body. This is closed by tonight. Hamish stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed over his chest, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea. He watched with a detached, quiet amusement as Blair continued his tirade. The DCI had managed to bully Rupert into a state of catatonic shock, and the young man was now sitting on a hard wooden bench, staring blankly at the floor. "He hasn't confessed to anything, sir," one of the junior officers ventured, trying to sound helpful. "He's just been sobbing for 3 hours." "Which is just as good as a confession," Blair countered, his voice rising in irritation. "It's the guilt manifesting. My job is to recognize the signs of a perpetrator under stress, and I am the expert here." Hamish sighed. Taking a slow, measured sip of his tea, he had spent the last 2 hours discreetly reviewing evidence against the physical realities of the crime. Earlier, while Blair was preoccupied with his dramatic interrogation, Hamish had slipped back into the dairy shed. He had examined the white, powdery substance that Blair had dismissed as accidental debris. It wasn't bath salts. It was chalk, the kind used by stage performers and high-end athletes for grip. Furthermore, he had taken a closer look at the antique churn. The inner rim of the vat was marked with a very specific, jagged pattern, consistent not with a struggle, but with a tool, a specialized tool. Hamish entered the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "Begging your pardon, sir," he drawled, his voice pitched to sound as unthreatening and dull as possible. "But I was just thinking, if Mr. Rupert here had killed her, he would have had to get the powder on his clothes. He's been wearing that same suit all day. Not a speck of white on it. It's almost as if he was never anywhere near the shed." Blair spun around, his eyes blazing. "I told you to keep out of this, Macbeth. Only your interference matches your incompetence. Get out of here before I have you suspended for obstruction of justice." "Aye, sir. Understood," Hamish said, feigning a look of confused humility. "I just thought it was odd, that's all. And the thing about the shoes, I noticed earlier that the footprints in the shed were a size 11. Mr. Rupert wears a 9. At best. It's written right there, on his loafers." Blair paused, the words hanging in the air. For a fleeting second, his ego flickered, caught between his desire to silence the village idiot and the undeniable, cold logic of the observation. But the prejudice was too deep. A size 11? You're blind and lazy, Macbeth. It's irrelevant. The man had a motive, and that's all that matters in a court of law. Hamish retreated, his expression carefully blank. He had done his part. He had planted the seed of doubt, even if Blair was too stubborn to acknowledge it. He walked out of the station and into the cool, biting air of the evening. Lugs were waiting for him, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the gravel. Hamish looked at the dog and offered a grim smile. He's so convinced he's right, Lugs, that he's blinded himself to the truth. He's going to hold that poor boy until he's blue in the face. And meanwhile, the real killer is sitting somewhere, feeling safe because the police have pinned the tail on the donkey. Hamish turned toward the village. He knew where he had to go next. The killer hadn't just left behind footprints. They had left behind a pattern of behavior that was as clear as a fingerprint. It wasn't money, weddings, or jewelry. It was about something deeply, painfully personal. And he, Hamish Macbeth, was the only person in Lockduff who wasn't looking at the obvious. He was looking at the shadows. And in those shadows, the truth was beginning to take a very distinct and very dangerous shape. He adjusted his cap, feeling the weight of the investigation shift from a nuisance to a necessity. The game was far from over. The night air in Lockduff had turned razor-sharp. The kind of cold that seemed to seep through wool and skin, to settle directly in the marrow. Hamish walked away from the station, his hands deep in his pockets and his shoulders hunched against the wind. He wasn't heading toward his cottage. Instead, he took the long, winding path that led up toward the servants' quarters and the old, disused storage rooms behind Glenmoor Castle. He was thinking about the size 11 footprint again. It was a detail so mundane that a man like DCI Blair would naturally disregard it, preferring the emotional narrative of a dramatic crime of passion. But to Hamish, who spent his days observing the habits of poachers and the subtle shifts in the behavior of the local wildlife, a footprint was a signature. It told a story of height, weight, and, most importantly, gait. As he reached the shadow of the castle's east wing, he stopped. He pulled out a small, bent flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it toward the ground near the service entrance. There, in the frost-hardened mud, were the clear impressions of a heavy, professional-grade boot. Not a delicate designer slipper, not a loafer, a worker's boot. He thought back to his earlier conversation with Priscilla and the rumors of Arabella's past, the maid whose life had been systematically dismantled by a spoiled, vindictive heiress. Arabella hadn't just been a bride. She was a collector of people's miseries, and she had traveled to the Highlands, thinking she could outrun the consequences of her own cruelty. A sudden movement in the darkness caught his eye. A tall, gaunt figure emerged from the side door of the castle, walking with a pronounced, dragging limp. Hamish extinguished his light and pressed himself into the deep shadows of an ancient stone archway. He watched as the figure moved toward the tool shed, their silhouette sharp against the moonlight. It wasn't a stranger. It was the estate's groundskeeper, a man named Callum who had been quiet, efficient, and utterly invisible for as long as anyone could remember. Callum had been the one to find the body, though he had been unusually eager to point Blair toward the groom's behavior. Hamish waited, his heart thumping a slow, steady rhythm in his chest. He didn't move. He simply watched, his mind cataloguing the facts, the limp, the access to the estate's heavy equipment, the intimate knowledge of the grounds. The motive wasn't about money. It wasn't about weddings or jewelry. It was about a debt of blood and lost dignity. Callum wasn't just a groundskeeper. He was the father of the girl who had been ruined by Arabella years ago. He had come to the Highlands not to serve, but to settle an account. Hamish felt a sudden, sharp pang of sympathy. He understood the desire for justice, the rage that burned quietly behind the eyes when the law failed to recognize a true wrong. But he also knew that murder, no matter how justified it might feel in the heat of a personal vendetta, was a path that led only to ruin. Callum had traded his own future to silence a woman who had spent her life destroying others. It wasn't a crime of passion for the groom, was it? Hamish whispered to himself, the cold air turning his breath into a ghostly plume of vapor. It was an execution. He stood perfectly still, letting the realization settle over him. The lazy policeman was gone. In his place was a man who understood the weight of the secrets that lived in the dark corners of the world. He realized now why the victim had been so frightened. She hadn't been scared of her groom. She had seen Callum, a ghost from the life she thought she had buried, and she had known that her time was running out. The motive was personal, petty, and profoundly human. The kind of motive that the textbooks Blair relied on would never adequately describe. It was the crushing weight of a grudge, refined over time until it became an inevitable act of violence. Hamish stepped out from the shadows, his presence signaled only by the soft crunch of gravel beneath his heavy, worn boots. He didn't rush, he didn't call for backup. He simply waited for the man to turn around, his face a calm, unreadable mask. The churn was a bit of a theatrical touch. "Don't you think, Callum?" Hamish said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the stillness of the night. The man stopped, his shoulders stiffening as he turned to face the constable. His face, caught in the pale wash of the moonlight, was etched with a lifetime of hard labor and suppressed boiling resentment. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a man who had finally, after years of waiting, laid down a burden that had become too heavy to carry. "She deserved it," Callum said, his voice raw, devoid of surprise or fear. "Maybe she did," Hamish replied, his expression softening with an empathy that was as genuine as it was dangerous. "But that doesn't change the fact that you're the one who has to live with the ghosts now." The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of years, the cold wind, and the inevitable, crushing reality of the law. Hamish took one step forward, his hand resting on the holster of his service pistol, though he made no move to draw it. He knew exactly what he had to do next, and for the first time in his career, he felt the heavy, lingering sadness of a truth that wouldn't bring anyone peace. The moment hung suspended in the freezing night air, a fragile silence broken only by the distant, mournful hoot of an owl in the woods. Callum, the groundskeeper, stood like a statue, his eyes reflecting a profound, exhausted resignation. He had spent years harboring the fire of his grievance, and now that it had finally consumed its object, the ashes were all that remained. Hamish didn't reach for his handcuffs. Instead, he took another step forward, his movements unhurried, almost casual. "You know, Callum, the thing about DCI Blair is that he's like a bull in a field. He'll charge at the first red rag he sees. He's already got the poor groom in his crosshairs. He's so blinded by his own vanity that he wouldn't see the truth if it bit him on the nose." Callum's brow furrowed slightly. "And what does that have to do with me, Constable?" "It gives us time," Hamish said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "Blair is going to spend the night working up his ego. He'll be back at the station, puffing his chest, waiting for a confession that isn't coming. It gives you a window, a chance to settle your own affairs before the inevitable." Callum narrowed his eyes, searching Hamish's face for a trick. "You're letting me go. You're a policeman. This is your duty." "My duty is to the truth," Hamish replied, his voice dropping to a low, steady murmur. "And the truth is, I've never been much of a fan of the way Blair runs things. There's a boat down at the end of the pier. It belongs to a fisherman who owes me a favor. It'll take you across the water to the mainland, where you can disappear into the hills. But you have to go now, before the morning shift starts." It was a gamble, a risky, calculated manipulation. Hamish needed Callum to move, panic, to prove to the rest of the world what he already knew. He wasn't letting him go. He was drawing him out. "Why?" Callum asked, his voice trembling. "Why help me?" "Because," Hamish lied smoothly, his eyes appearing as vacant and simple as he needed them to be. "I'm just a lazy copper who doesn't want to spend all night writing up a murder report. It's far too much paperwork for a Tuesday." Callum hesitated for only a heartbeat, then, with a sharp nod, turned and began to limp toward the lower path that led to the docks. As soon as the groundskeeper was out of sight, Hamish's demeanor shifted. The vacant, lazy mask vanished, replaced by an intense, crystalline focus. He turned to Lugs, who had been watching the exchange with an alert, intelligent gaze. "Go, Lugs. Keep him in sight, but stay low. Don't let him see you." The dog took off like a shot, disappearing into the undergrowth. Hamish didn't wait. He sprinted, his long legs eating up the distance, not toward the pier, but toward the station. He needed to get there before Blair made a move. His plan was simple and dangerous. He would alert the station that the groundskeeper was fleeing, but he would do it in a way that forced Blair to act on his own arrogance. He would leak the information to Blair's junior officer, the one who was actually competent, knowing full well it would make its way to the DCI in minutes. He burst into the station 5 minutes later, gasping for breath, looking every bit the bumbling, disorganized policeman he was supposed to be. "Sir, sir," he shouted, rushing into the interrogation room where Blair was still hovering over the terrified, weeping groom. "I found him, the groundskeeper. He's heading for the pier. He's trying to escape. Blair's face went purple, but this time it wasn't with anger. It was with the thrill of the hunt. What, the groundskeeper? Are you certain, you useless imbecile? I saw him, sir. He was running, well, limping toward the water. He looked like he was heading for a boat. I tried to stop him, but he threatened me with a garden spade. I had to run for help. Blair grabbed his coat, his eyes alight with the desperate need to be the hero who caught the real culprit, even if it meant abandoning the confession he had been so certain of only minutes before. Forget the groom, get the squad, move. If he reaches that boat, we'll never catch him. Hamish watched them scramble, their confusion and excitement working exactly as he had calculated. He stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face hidden in the shadows. He had set the trap, baited it with the DCI's own ego. And now the hunt was on. He had led Callum to the water, knowing that the police would be there waiting. And in the chaos of the arrest, the truth would be forced to the surface, and Blair would be left with no choice but to see what had been there all along. He leaned against the wall, catching his breath, feeling the cool, crisp air on his face. It was almost over. He was tired, he was hungry, and he desperately wanted a cup of coffee. But for the first time in his career, he felt the sharp, exhilarating satisfaction of having played the system better than the man who was supposed to be in charge. The trap was sprung, and in a matter of moments, the truth would be laid bare for all to see. The air down by the locked-up of pier was thick with the scent of brine, rotting kelp, and the metallic tang of impending rain. The moon had slipped behind a thick curtain of clouds, leaving the shoreline in near total darkness. Hamish stood behind a stack of weathered lobster pots, his eyes fixed on the figure of Callum, who was frantically untying a small, battered fishing boat from its moorings. The water slapped rhythmically against the wooden pilings, a sound that seemed to mock the urgency of the man's movements. Lugg sat silently at Hamish's feet, his ears pricked forward, a low vibration in his throat being the only sign of the dog's tension. The plan was in motion. Hamish had calculated the time it would take for DCI Blair and his frantic team to descend from the castle road to the waterfront. It was a race against the clock, and the stakes were higher than just a simple arrest. Callum, Hamish called out, his voice not a shout, but a low, carrying rasp that cut through the darkness. The groundskeeper froze, his hands gripping the wet rope of the boat's painter. He turned slowly, his face a hollow, ghost-like mask in the gloom. You, he breathed, the word heavy with a sudden, dawning realization. You didn't help me. You used me. I gave you a choice, Hamish said, stepping into the small pool of light cast by a flickering lamp on the pier. He looked weary, his uniform damp with sea spray, his cap pulled low over his eyes. I knew you'd come here. It was the only place you could go. I didn't want a bloodbath at the castle. Callum, I wanted this over with. You have no idea what she was. Callum stepped out of the boat, his limp more pronounced now, his frame shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and rage. She wasn't a person. She was a disease. She took everything from my family. She thought she could just move on, marry into wealth, and leave the wreckage of her life behind her. I wasn't just killing a bride, Constable. I was balancing a ledger. Justice doesn't look like that, Hamish replied, his voice firm, and it certainly doesn't look like hiding in a boat in the dark. Before Callum could respond, the silence was shattered by the screech of tires and the blaring of a police siren from the road above. Beams of light cut through the mist, sweeping erratically across the pier. DCI Blair was here, and he was predictably in a state of absolute shrieking hysteria. There he is. Blair's voice boomed over a megaphone, vibrating with an unearned sense of triumph. Freeze, your murdering animals. We have you cornered. Macbeth, where are you? Get out of the way before you get hurt, Callum panicked. He lunged back toward the boat, his hand disappearing into his heavy coat, as if reaching for a weapon. Hamish didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the lobster pots, his movements surprisingly graceful for a man who spent his life appearing lethargic. He collided with Callum just as the groundskeeper reached the edge of the pier. They went down together on the wet, slippery wood, a tangled mess of limbs and angry shouts. Don't do it, Callum, Hamish hissed, pinning the man's arm to the pier. If you pull a weapon on them, they won't bring you in alive. They're looking for a reason to end this. Callum fought with the desperate strength of a man with nothing left to lose, his fingers clawing at the wooden planks. Hamish, drawing on a hidden well of strength and physical resilience, the kind often overlooked in the lazy village bobby, wrestled him into submission. It was a messy, undignified scuffle. There was no heroism, no dramatic music, just the desperate, gritty reality of a man trying to stop another man from throwing his life away. "You're making a mistake," Callum roared, his voice cracking. "I'm keeping you alive," Hamish countered, finally wrenching a heavy, rusted garden trowel from Callum's grip and tossing it into the dark water of the loch with a decisive splash. Blair and his officers swarmed onto the pier, weapons drawn, their faces lit by the strobing red and blue of the cruiser lights. Blair shoved past his subordinates, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. "Macbeth, get off him!" Blair shrieked, aiming his pistol toward the struggling pair. "You've interfered enough. We'll take it from here." Hamish slowly climbed to his feet, leaving Callum pinned under the heavy, practiced boots of the junior constable. He dusted off his knees, his face impassive. He had the groundskeeper, he had the motive, and he had, in the most spectacular fashion, ensured that the wrong suspect was entirely forgotten. Blair loomed over him, trembling with rage. "You had him all along, didn't you? You didn't tell us where he was. You went behind my back." Hamish looked at him, his hazel eyes clear and sharp, the vacuous mask dropped entirely. "I told you, sir. I was doing my job. He was trying to flee. I apprehended him. It's all in the report you'll be writing." Blair looked ready to strike him, but the presence of the other officers and the flashing lights kept his temper barely in check. He signaled for his men to drag Callum away. As the groundskeeper was hauled to his feet, he looked at Hamish one last time. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only a hollow, empty stare. "It wasn't worth it," Hamish whispered, loud enough only for the two of them to hear. The pier was left in sudden, jarring silence. The adrenaline was fading, leaving Hamish with a familiar, aching tiredness in his bones. He watched as the lights of the police cars pulled away, the red and blue strobes dancing on the water like dying embers. He had done it. The killer was in custody. The innocent groom was being processed for release, and the village of Lochdabuff would wake up to find its peace restored. But as he turned back toward his Land Rover, the cold wind biting at his exposed neck, he felt the heavy, lingering weight of the truth. It was a victory, but it felt remarkably like a loss. He whistled for Lugs, who emerged from the shadows to trot faithfully at his heels. It was time to go home. The village didn't need to know the cost of the justice he had just delivered. They only needed to know that the monster had been caught. He climbed into his car, the engine turning over with a steady, comforting purr, and left the pier to the silence of the night. The morning after the arrest, the sun rose over Lochdabuff with a stubborn, cheerful brightness that seemed entirely inappropriate for the grim events of the previous night. Hamish Macbeth sat in his small, cluttered office, staring at a blank piece of paper that was meant to be his official report. Outside, the village was slowly beginning to stir. He could hear the distant clatter of milk crates and the muffled sound of Mr. Patel opening his shop. It was a normal morning, yet the air felt strangely heavy, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the echo of the night's violence to dissipate. The door to his station swung open without a knock. DCI Blair marched in, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster, his face still flushed, though now with the glow of self-satisfaction, rather than rage. He was clutching a thick file folder, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. "Macbeth," Blair barked, his voice filling the cramped space and making the radio on the desk rattle. "I've just come from the press conference. I've laid out the entire case. The arrest of the suspect, the recovery of the evidence, the swift resolution of this tragic, high-profile murder. It's a masterclass in modern police work." Hamish didn't look up from his desk. He continued to fiddle with his pen, his expression carefully blank. His posture slumped in a way that suggested he was barely conscious. "Aye, sir. I'm sure you did a grand job. The media must be thrilled." Blair leaned over the desk, his eyes narrowing. He had spent the last hour convincing himself that the previous night's chaos was entirely the result of his own brilliant intuition. I didn't mention your little adventure on the pier, Macbeth. It was, frankly, an amateurish display of physical bravado that nearly compromised the integrity of the crime scene. I've filed the official report as a Strathbane-led operation. I've cited my own strategic oversight in the tactical apprehension of the suspect. Hamish leaned back, letting his jaw slacken just enough to look vacant. That's the right kind of you, sir. I'm just a local constable. I don't really know much about strategy or tactics. I'm just happy the village is quiet again. Blair's expression softened, a flicker of genuine relief crossing his features. He had been terrified that Hamish might try to claim credit, that the village idiot might actually reveal he had orchestrated the entire scenario to force Blair's hand. The fact that Hamish was so willing to retreat into the shadows only confirmed Blair's narrow-minded view of his subordinate. You're a useful man to have around when you keep your head down, Macbeth, Blair said, his tone bordering on patronizing. I've decided not to pursue a disciplinary inquiry regarding your unorthodox behavior last night. Consider it a learning experience. You've had your moment of excitement. Now go back to doing whatever it is you do to fill your time. Thank you, sir, Hamish said, his voice slow and heavy with feigned gratitude. I'll get right back to the paperwork. I'm sure it'll take me all day. Blair huffed, straightened his tie, and marched back out of the station. Hamish watched him through the window as he climbed into his car and sped off, the tires spraying gravel in his wake. He watched until the blue light of the patrol car disappeared around the bend, leaving the village to the silence of the morning. He felt a deep, profound sense of relief. The transfer he had dreaded, the promotion that would have dragged him away to a city desk, it was all gone. Blair would go back to Strathbane, regaling his peers with tales of his own investigative genius, and Hamish would remain here, in the quiet, damp solitude of Lockduff. The truth of the murder, the messy, human reality of it, would be buried in a file that no one would ever bother to read. It was a small, quiet victory, but in his own way, it was exactly the kind of justice Hamish preferred. He stood up, stretched his lanky frame, and walked over to the stove. The kettle was whistling, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the lingering gloom of the office. He poured a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the cool air, and took a long, slow sip. The taste was bitter, strong, and entirely satisfying. He looked over at Lugs, who was curled up on his rug, one eye open and watching him with patient, canine wisdom. We did it, Lugs, Hamish whispered, a small, tired smile touching the corners of his mouth. He thinks he's the hero, and we get to stay in the Highlands. A fair trade, I'd say. He walked to the window and looked out toward the mountains. The clouds were beginning to break, revealing patches of deep, brilliant blue. The village was returning to its natural rhythm, the pulse of daily life resuming its slow, steady beat. The murder was a shadow that had passed, leaving behind nothing but a lesson that no one would learn and a story that no one would ever fully understand. He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the medal or the promotion. He had his freedom, his mountains, and the quiet, secret knowledge of a man who knew exactly how the world worked. He finished his coffee, set the mug down, and walked toward the door, ready to face the day. The case was closed, the records were settled, and as far as the rest of the world was concerned, the most dangerous thing that had happened in Lockduff was a case of mistaken identity. He stepped out into the crisp, morning air, feeling lighter than he had in weeks, prepared to sink back into his routine, perfectly happy to be the invisible man in the most beautiful place on earth. The week that followed the arrest of the groundskeeper was one of those rare transcendent periods in Lockduff, where the weather seemed to apologize for its previous harshness. The wind had died down to a gentle whisper, and the clouds parted to reveal a sky so blue it looked like an artist had painted it with a single unhesitating stroke. The mountains, usually looming and foreboding, were bathed in a soft, golden light that made them look almost welcoming. It was the sort of Highland weather that made a man wonder why anyone would ever want to live anywhere else. Hamish Macbeth was back in his natural habitat, the absolute, blissful vacuum of doing nothing. He was sitting on the edge of the old stone pier, his legs dangling over the water, his fishing rod lying forgotten on the mossy wood beside him. Lugs were stretched out in the sun, his ears twitching occasionally at the sound of the gulls. There were no murders to solve, no arrogant Sassenachs to deal with, and most importantly, no DCI Blair shouting into a radio. The village had largely moved on. The Sterling party had packed up their massive, gleaming coach and vanished, leaving behind nothing but a few expensive cigarette butts and the lingering scent of stale perfume. The castle had returned to its usual, drafty silence, the local staff relieved to be rid of the demands of the wealthy. Life in Lochta was like a calm pool. You could throw a rock into it, and for a few moments, the ripples would spread and disturb the surface. But soon enough, the water would settle, and everything would be as it had been before. Hamish took a slow sip of the coffee he had brought from the hotel. It was rich, hot, and tasted infinitely better than the thin, watery liquid he usually brewed on his own stove. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun soak into his bones, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He had survived another brush with ambition, another attempt by the outside world to drag him into its messy, complicated machinery, and he had come out the other side entirely unscathed. He thought about the case, fleetingly. He thought about Callum, sitting in a cell in the city, the weight of his actions finally settling in. There was no joy in the thought, only a quiet, melancholy acceptance. The world was full of people like Callum people, who carried their pain like a stone in their shoe, waiting for the day they could finally stop walking. Hamish knew he couldn't save them all, and he certainly couldn't force the world to be a place where justice was always clean and simple. All he could do was watch, listen, and occasionally, when the need was dire, nudge the scales just enough to keep the chaos from consuming the village he loved. A soft, familiar footstep sounded on the wooden planks behind him. Hamish didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew the crisp, rhythmic tap of her heels, the light, expensive fragrance of her perfume that always seemed to cut through the smell of salt and fish. "I thought I might find you here," Priscilla said, her voice soft. "Aye," Hamish replied, still looking at the lock. "It's a good day for contemplating the scenery. Or, more accurately, contemplating not contemplating anything at all." Priscilla sat down on the pier, a few feet away from him, her posture perfect, her coat immaculate. She looked out at the water, her expression unreadable. "The village is talking, you know. They say the groundskeeper just snapped. They say it was a terrible, tragic accident of timing. They usually get the story right in the end," Hamish said, picking up his rod and giving it a half-hearted tug. "Even if the details are all wrong." Priscilla turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "You did well, Hamish, not just with the arrest, but with how you handled it. Blair is still telling everyone he cracked the case, and you're still the lazy local copper. You gave up the glory for your own peace of mind. Not many men would do that." "I'm not a man of glory, Priscilla," Hamish said with a wry, tired smile. "I'm a man of habit. Glory is far too exhausting. It requires too much maintenance." Priscilla laughed, a rare, genuine sound that made the air feel suddenly, inexplicably lighter. "I suppose you're right. You're a terrible, infuriating, impossible man, Hamish Macbeth." "Aye," he agreed, watching a small silver fish jump in the distance. "But I'm a local, and that's what counts." She stood up after a few moments, brushing off her coat. "I'm leaving for London tomorrow. My parents think the Highlands are a bit much after the events of the last few days." "They are a bit much," Hamish conceded. "They aren't for everyone." "I'll miss it," she said, and for a fleeting second, the armor of her social standing dropped, revealing a loneliness that mirrored his own. "I'll miss the quiet. The quiet will be here when you come back," he said, turning to look at her. She offered him a small, sad smile, then turned and walked back toward the village, her silhouette becoming smaller and smaller against the bright, open landscape. Hamish watched her go, then turned his gaze back to the water. He was alone again, but it wasn't a lonely kind of solitude. It was the solitude of a man who belonged to the land, who felt the pulse of the hills in his own heartbeat. He stood up, whistled for lugs, and began the slow, easy walk back to his cottage. The evening shadows were beginning to lengthen, the world turning into a soft, golden blur of peace. He had his pot of stew waiting on the stove, a warm bed, and a life that was exactly as he wanted it to be. He was home, and for Hamish Macbeth, That was the only truth that ever really mattered.